What happens when an elderly veteran is asked to leave the threshold of a military academy? He remains silent, but what happens next will cause even the general himself to rip off his medals. The cold crept under his clothes, as if it knew where it would hurt the most. He had been standing at the academy gates since morning, not looking around, not saying a word. He just stood there. His back was straight, his gaze fixed through the iron. His jacket was old and faded, with 3 neat patches on the elbows. There was nothing on his chest. No insignia, no name. Everything that could have told you who he was had long since been cut off. Or torn off. His name was Harold Mason. But no one here knew that. People passed by, cadets, officers, drivers in Fords, cleaning ladies in uniforms. Some nodded, some turned away. One teenager even took a photo of him on his phone, but when their eyes met, he quickly put it away in his pocket. A corporal stood guard at the entrance. He was very young, with unshaven cheeks and sleepy eyes. He had been nervous for 2 hours. "Sir," he said, stepping out of the booth uncertainly. "Have you lost something?" The old man looked at him. Slowly. Not rudely. With interest, as if he hadn't been spoken to like a human being in a long time. "I'm waiting," he replied simply. "For whom?" "We'll see." There was no anger or pleading in his voice. Only stubbornness. Silent, heavy. The kind that makes you want to turn away. The corporal stood there for a moment, shrugged, and returned to his post. A minute later, he picked up the phone to call someone upstairs. Not by the book, of course, but screw it. Better to ask than to write a report later. Harold stayed where he was. He didn't sit down, even when offered a chair. He didn't look around, even when people looked at him suspiciously. He just stared ahead, as if he knew exactly where the person he was waiting for would appear. Another 40 minutes passed. Then a familiar sound came from the road, heavy, measured, like the footsteps of a drill team. An SUV pulled out from around the corner, shiny as if it had been polished. There were flags on the sides and a special license plate. Cars like this don't usually stop. But this one stopped right at the gate. A man got out of the car. He was tall and broad-shouldered. His uniform fit him like a museum mannequin. Ribbons, stars, medals, everything was in place. But his face was not ceremonial. Frozen. Pale. He immediately noticed Harold. And Harold noticed him. The general took a step closer. Slowly. As if the distance between them was not 3 meters, but 30 years. He came up close, did not extend his hand, did not say, "Hello." He just stared. There was something in that gaze that would have sent a chill down the cadets' spines. "You," Harold did not answer. The general swallowed. His throat twitched, like someone who was about to feel sick. He looked around, as if searching for someone who could see them. A corporal stood in the distance, pretending to write in his notebook. "Where have you been all this time?" "I've been living," Harold said simply. There was a pause. A dull, long pause. Like the time between a gunshot and the realization that you've been hit. General Cowan sighed. He abruptly tore off his cap and threw it onto the hood of the SUV. His face suddenly looked older. Not just older, but older. Like a man whose life had happened faster than he had time to prepare for it. "You should have died," he said, as if stating a fact. "It almost worked," Harold nodded. "But you know we've always had bad timing." The general lowered his eyes. His fingers trembled. He reached for his chest, where his medals hung. A second. Another. Then a sudden movement. The ribbons were torn off, and the metal clattered onto the concrete. A woman in uniform, a captain by her insignia, was walking by. She saw what had happened and stopped. She bent down to pick up the medals, but the general raised his hand sharply, "Don't touch them." She froze. She looked at Harold, then at Cowan, and walked on as if nothing had happened. But there was a slight fear in her gait, the kind that only those who are used to living by the rules and now suddenly find themselves without a plan betray. Harold didn't look at the medals. He didn't put on his jacket. He didn't take a step. "You didn't come here for that," said Cowan. "You're wrong," replied Harold. "Then why?" Silence. And then suddenly, "I came so you could look me in the eyes." Finally. These words did not sound like an accusation. They did not sound like a threat. They sounded like a request. A tired one. Bitter. Final. The general wiped his forehead. Then, slowly, as if deciding something, he turned toward the car. "Will you wait?" "I can," said Harold. He stood where he stood. Nothing changed. But the air around him was different. Thick. Heavy. Like before a storm that you can't see but can feel on your skin. The corporal inside the booth nervously fiddled with the handles. He still didn't understand what was going on, but he sensed that this was not just a veteran at the gate. It was something more. Something that smelled of archives, stale truth, and tobacco smoke from old army barracks. Meanwhile, General Cowan returned. He was holding a folder, thin, green, stained with coffee. He stood opposite Harold and looked into his face, which showed no resentment or anger. Only fatigue. The kind that comes to those who have carried someone else's silence for too long. "This is everything," Cowan said quietly, "everything you didn't say back then. Or couldn't say." He opened the folder. He showed him the pages, one after another. Copies, reports, diagrams, signatures. Everything that had once been erased from the open files. Harold didn't look. He didn't reach for it. He already knew what was there. "It won't change anything," he said. "But maybe it will explain," Cowan replied wearily. They were silent. The cadets passed by again, deliberately slowing their pace. Someone even whispered, "It's him," but no one dared to approach. Because standing nearby was something that was not in the regulations. Memory. Shame. And the truth that had been hidden away in a closet with other uniforms for too long. Finally, Harold spoke. "Have you ever heard a man cry without making a sound?" Cowan blinked. Then he shook his head. "It was that night. He was lying next to me. He no longer had a face. Only his breathing. He tried to scream, but there was only a rattle. And then, nothing. Silence. And the smell of blood on the fur of the sleeping bag." Cowan didn't answer. He didn't even breathe. "And you ordered us to wait," Harold continued. "Because there was a restricted area on the map. Because the rules don't allow it. Because there was no order. And we waited. And he was dying." Harold's voice was hoarse, as if it were tearing through a throat that had long been accustomed to silence. But he spoke. "And now you're standing here. In uniform. With papers. With corrections. And he's a number on a plaque that they forgot to update on the website." Cowan looked down. The medals were still lying on the concrete. One had turned over, revealing an engraved cross. Harold suddenly bent down and picked one up. He held it in his hand as if trying to understand how much a lie weighs. "Do you want me to forgive you?" he asked, not looking up. "I don't know what I want," the general said honestly. "I just couldn't not come out." The old man put the medal back. Carefully. As if he didn't want it to get scratched. "Then stand next to me. Like you did then. When everything collapsed. Only now, stay until the end." And he stood at the gate again. Next to him was the general. No guards, no cameras, no words. Just two men bound by something that could never be recovered. Night fell unexpectedly quickly, as if in a hurry to cover up everything that had happened during the day. There was no longer a crowd at the gate. Even the corporal had been replaced. A young female replacement with a tattoo on her neck glanced furtively at the two men standing next to each other. One was wearing a worn jacket. The other was in uniform, but without any insignia. They were still lying at his feet, as if he had discarded his rank. The light at the gate flickered like an old TV. The air was damp and smelled of leaves, alcohol, and smoke from a nearby fast food joint. But none of them moved. They stood there, not as friends, not as enemies, but as two people whose past could not be contained in a report. For the first time that day, Harold spoke without a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Have you ever tried to sleep when you think your friend is calling you again?" The general was silent. "I have. For 20 years. Every damn night. And every night I get up, as if on cue, to check, just in case it's now. And then I look down the empty corridor. And I go back. To my bunk. Where the springs squeak louder than my conscience." He spoke simply. Without pathos. As if he were tired even of these words. And he didn't seem to expect an answer. He was just letting out what had been building up for years. "Lance and I were arguing then, remember? You ordered us to hold our positions. But he wanted to pull out the guy who was stuck in the radius. You refused. He went on his own. And they riddled him like a trash can." Cowan closed his eyes. "I thought you were dead, Harold." "Me too. Especially inside." For a moment, there was nothing between them but the road. Empty. Black. And the rustling of tires in the distance. Then the general sat down on the concrete slab. He tucked his legs under him. He rubbed his face with both hands, as if trying to wipe away something that couldn't be wiped away. "I don't know why you came," he said. "But I know I can't go on living as if nothing happened." "That's good," said Harold. "Because I can't either." He took a worn envelope out of his inside pocket. It was wrapped in tape, with a stain in the corner that looked like dried blood. Inside was just one thing, an audio cassette. Written on it in pen was, "Delta. January." The general recognized the handwriting. The cassette was old, one of those that no longer record, with a cloudy film inside. It could have been overlooked, discarded, thrown away. But Harold had kept it in his pocket for 3 decades, like a piece of truth that could not be entrusted to anyone. Not even himself. "You kept it," said Cowan, without looking up. "I hid it. Not because I was afraid. Because no one would have listened. I would have listened. It's too late, John." The name slipped out as if by accident. But there was no anger or reproach in Harold's voice. Only a burnt-out longing. He took out an old music player. The buttons were worn, and the case was held together with a rubber band. The battery was dead, the speaker was cracked, but it still worked. Because Harold charged it every month. He knew that sooner or later this day would come. Click. The rustle of tape. And then, a voice. Young, sharp, confident. Without a tremor. The voice of someone who doesn't yet know that he is about to sign someone's death warrant. "Delta Post, come in, contact at 200 yards, no visual confirmation." Then, a familiar intonation. A commanding tone, calm, polished, "Hold your fire. Don't move forward. I repeat, don't move forward. No orders from above." Cowan clenched his fingers. "Damn it, we've got one of our own in there, sir. Unconfirmed. Hold your position. No one moves without orders." And then it came, the second that decided everything. A cry. Not a word, a wheeze. As if someone had torn his vocal cords. "Lance. Back. Lance, you son of a bitch." A click. Silence. The tape was over. The general closed his eyes. He didn't breathe for a long time. His face was gray. Not from the cold, from the past that had finally caught up with him. "Who wrote this?" he asked. "Me. I was a signalman back then. I kept a log, as I was taught." "Why didn't you hand it in?" "Because back then I still believed that honor wasn't just a word on a banner. And then you got your star. And I got discharged for medical reasons. No right to appeal. The diagnosis, emotional disorder caused by stress. I waited for at least one of you to say, we were wrong. But no one did." He turned off the player. Carefully put the cassette back in its case. "And now here you are, sitting here. And I'm still standing." Conan stood up. Sat down next to him. His hands were shaking. He didn't touch the metals under his feet. His eyes said it all. The uniform, the fear, and what was left behind the doors of the offices where other people's fates were being decided. "What do you want, Harold?" "Not what. That. That you don't brush this off as an archival error. That you say it out loud, at least once." "What?" "That we were right. And you were wrong." Cowan was silent. He didn't even move. He just stared into space, as if trying to remember who he was back then, more than 20 years ago. Not a general. Not a legend. Just an officer sitting in a bunker with a map and a radio. And decisive, to wait or to rescue. "I thought then that if I said, go, and it turned out to be a trap, the whole squad would die," he said at last. "And if I said, stop, one might die." "One." "Not one," Harold cut him off. Lance wasn't alone. He had a mother. He had a sister. He had a child he never got to see. So he wasn't alone, John. Never alone. He didn't say it loudly or emphatically. But every word was like a nail in a board, one by one. To make it stick. Cowan stood up and walked over to the medals. He stared at them for a long time. Then he bent down, picked one up, and held it in his hand. As if weighing it. "I was reprimanded for this cross. Not because I gave the order, but because I didn't mention the dead afterwards. They told me, it doesn't make you guilty." I believed them. I believed that anything that wasn't on paper didn't count. "Did you count them yourself?" The general stared at the medal for a long time. Then he clenched his fist. The metal dug painfully into his palm. "I counted them," he whispered. "Every night. First the shots. Then the numbers. And then Lance's face. He was smiling when we first took him into the company. He thought the army was an honor. And I turned him into a statistic. A casualty. -1. -3 more. Minus myself." Harold looked calm. Without triumph. Without satisfaction. Because it wasn't a victory. It was something that should have happened long ago. And it was still too late. "Now you've started talking," he said quietly. Cowan suddenly turned to him. His eyes were shining. "You think I didn't know you'd show up one day? That you'd be standing at the gate like a final sentence? I'm not a sentence. I'm a witness. And I'm standing here so that someone will finally admit it. For real. Not on paper. Not in the archives. But here. In front of everyone who saw but remained silent." The wind picked up a piece of old newspaper and swirled it between them. It was as if it too was looking for a place to stand, on the side of fear or on the side of truth. Cowan slowly walked toward the gate. Right to where Harold had been standing since morning. He stood next to him. He took off his jacket. He was left in his shirt, cold in the winter air. And he whispered, "I was wrong." And again there was silence. The kind of silence in which you can even hear your heart pause between beats. In the morning, Harold was standing at the gate again. As if he had never left. In his hand was a thermos of cold coffee, and in his pocket was the same cassette tape. He had no intention of leaving. Not because he was stubborn, but because he didn't see the point. He slept poorly that night. As always. In the shelter on the outskirts, there were 3 beds in a room with a creaky door and a window overlooking a wall. Sleep came in fits and starts. In one dream, he was back in Delta Block. In another, Lance was alive, laughing, throwing snowballs and saying, "Damn, Harry, you're getting old." Then he woke up in a sweat, as if he had missed his chance again. By morning, his hands were shaking. His body felt like a bag of bones. His head was buzzing. But he came. Because if not him, then no one. The gates opened 20 minutes later. A lieutenant came out to him, young, well-rested. With a folder. With a document. His voice was businesslike. "Mr. Mason, the command requests that you no longer appear without notice. Here, sign here." Harold didn't take it. "I'm not under your command." "Nevertheless. We must maintain order. Order is when 3 people don't die in silence." The guy was taken aback. Then he shrugged and put the document back in the folder. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "Exactly," said Harold. He turned and walked away. But not home. He drove to the other end of town. To the old building that used to house the veterans' office. Now it was rented out as offices. He didn't know why he was going there. Maybe out of habit. Maybe in the hope that someone hadn't forgotten. The intercom at the entrance wasn't working. He pushed the door with his shoulder. Inside, it smelled of dust and mold. The posters on the walls were faded, like faces in old photo albums. He walked down the hallway. A light was on in the far office. A man was sitting at a desk. He wore glasses. He was elderly. His face looked like it belonged to another era. He looked up and recognized Harold immediately. But he had trouble getting the name out. "Sergeant Mason." "Damn. I thought you." "Yes," Harold nodded. Many people did. They sat down. There was a long silence. Then the veteran employee said, "You were with Lance back then, weren't you?" "I remember. We all thought you were the one who survived. But you disappeared. I wasn't there. And I didn't know how to come back. Because if you come back, you have to say something. And I didn't know what to say." He placed the cassette on the table. "This is what should have been said back then." The man in glasses took it. He turned it over in his hands. His eyes suddenly became moist. "I'll file a report. We'll dig it all up. It doesn't matter how much time has passed." Harold smiled crookedly. "Time has passed in vain. It has passed for us." He stood up, nodded, and walked away. His head was empty. It was as if he had emptied it of everything. And now he didn't know what to do with it. That same evening, Harold found himself back at the gate. Not because he wanted an answer. Simply because he didn't know where else to go. The gatehouse was empty. The shift had changed somewhere in the building. A dim light shone above the gate. The corporal, the same one from before, came out with a mug and, seeing Harold, was surprised. "You, again?" "Yes," he replied. "Again." The corporal hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and took out a chocolate bar wrapper. "Want a piece?" Harold took it. He thanked him. They ate in silence. Under the streetlight. Like 2 people from different times, but from the same cold. "You won't achieve anything, will you?" the corporal asked suddenly. "Maybe." "Then why?" The old man looked at him. He didn't answer. He just nodded toward the building. "See those windows?" "I see them. When I served here, there was an office behind those windows. My commander sat there. And every time we returned, he would come up and ask, "Everyone okay?" And he would look us in the eyes. Not at our uniforms. Not at our reports. But in our eyes. The corporal was silent. "And then everything changed," added Harold. "Papers are more important. Literacy instead of conscience. Medals instead of apologies." He took an old photograph out of his inside pocket. There were 5 of them in it. Young. Smiling. In front of a truck. One of them was Lance. Alive, foolish, sunny. He wanted to be a teacher. He wrote that after his service he would start a history club for children. You should have heard him talk about World War II. Better than any lecturer. He knew what needed to be remembered. Not dates. Faces. The corporal took the photo. Held it. "I thought you were angry at the army." "I'm not angry at the army. I'm angry at the silence. At how easily we forget. And how easily we justify it. I'm no hero, kid. I stood by and kept quiet when I should have shouted. And here I am now. At least now I can be heard." The corporal nodded. He didn't know what to say. And maybe that was for the best. Harold looked up at the sky. It was dark, with no stars. Only the moon, like a dim spotlight, illuminated his jacket. It was heavy inside. Not from memories, but from emptiness. As if everything he carried had already been given away. And in return, there was silence. But he stayed. Because if not him, then no one. It started raining at night. It was light, cold, and seemed angry, as if it didn't want to just fall, but wanted to prove that he didn't belong there. Harold didn't leave. He stood under a canopy, but his back was already wet. Water ran down his collar, down his shoulders, and into his sleeves. His hands clenched into fists, not out of anger, but from the cold. And from the fact that everything that had been important was now useless to anyone. Count came out again. Without his uniform. In his usual coat. For the first time, without pride on his shoulders. He approached and looked at Harold. Harold didn't even notice him at first. His eyes were fixed on the ground. As if looking for someone who would never return. "I filed my report today," Count said quietly. "What for?" Harold asked. Without mockery. Just as a matter of fact. "Not because of you. Because of myself." "Is there a difference?" Count shrugged. He was not the same as on the first day. His back was bent. His stubble was streaked with gray. His eyes were dull. And yet they were alive. Like a man who had seen himself without his uniform for the first time. "I tried to explain, but they wouldn't listen. They said, too much time has passed. The archives have been burned. The witnesses are dead. Only you remain." "That's enough," said Harold. "Because the truth doesn't need proof. It just stands at the gate. And waits." The rain grew heavier. It rattled on the visor and dripped onto his boots. Harold sank heavily onto the folding stool left by the corporal. His shoulders were stiff, his legs ached, and he felt empty inside. But he held on. "You know," he said, "I'm not standing here because I want you fired. It's not because I want your blood. I just want someone, anyone, to see what happened." "I see. It's too late." "No," Count exhaled. "It's not too late. As long as you're here, it's not too late." He sank to his knees, right into the puddle. He stretched out his arms as if taking an oath. And whispered, "Forgive me." Words that hadn't been spoken in 30 years. Words that had been stuck in his throat, unable to pass. Harold looked at him for a long time. Then he slowly stood up. With effort. As if something had broken inside him. He bent down, picked up the wet metal, the one that had been lying at the gate all this time. He held it in his hand. Then he gave it back to Conan. "It's not me you need to forgive," he said. "It's you who has to live with it." And he left. Not to the bus. Not home. Just away. Toward the city. In the rain. Without an umbrella. Without a plan. Because sometimes, in order to let go, you have to go through all the pain first, every last drop. 2 days after the rain, Harold didn't show up at the gate. Not at 6, not at 8, not at noon. The guards were surprised. They were used to him, like a streetlight at an intersection, always there. And suddenly, nothing. The corporal, now the senior guard, went out into the street himself and stood there for a while. He looked at the road. Then at the sky. Then at the bench where Harold sometimes sat with his thermos. The wind was blowing an old newspaper there, and for a moment it seemed to him that it was he himself, not Harold, not an officer, but just a piece of paper fluttering between the rain and oblivion. The next day, General Cowan left the academy. Quietly. Without speeches. Without a farewell ceremony. He just gathered his things, put them in 2 suitcases, and left. The guard didn't even recognize him at first. His uniform was gone. Just a coat, shirt, and tie. And his eyes were empty. As if he were no longer human. And the frame that once held his portrait. He left the keys to his office on the table. Along with a note, "I was the one who remained silent. Now I speak. Whoever wants to hear me, let them come and find me." No one ever saw him again. Harold, meanwhile, was sitting on the floor of the shelter. The room was empty. His neighbor had been transferred to a hospice, and the other had gone to live with his sister in Arkansas. He was left behind. With his suitcase. With a box of cassettes. And with a single photograph in which everyone was still alive. He ran his fingers along the edge of the blanket, as if searching for something between the threads. Memories, hopes, meaning, everything that had long since worn thin. There was a knock at the door. He didn't answer. Because he knew it wasn't for him. He had already said everything he needed to say. A woman was standing in the doorway. She was about 40 years old. She was holding a box. Her face was uncertain. She knocked again. "Mr. Mason." Her voice trembled. He stood up. Slowly. Like a man whose insides had long since been twisted into a knot. "Who are you?" "My name is Amy. I'm Lance's daughter. I was named after his mother. I found you." He didn't immediately understand what he was hearing. Then he sat back down. Because his legs gave way. "How did you?" "I received a letter. With a copy of the report. Your name was on it. I didn't know my father had someone close to him. There, at that moment." He looked at her as if she were a figure from a dream. A dream where everything could be rewritten. "Why did you come?" "Because you were with him. Because I wanted someone to say, he wasn't just a number. Not just a name on a report. He was a person. A father." And Harold cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Like old people who can no longer keep up appearances. He just sat on the floor and held on to the box of photographs. And she stood next to him. Without saying a word. Because some things don't need to be explained. After her visit, Harold didn't leave his room for a long time. Not because he was sick, he just didn't know where to go. He stood at the gate for something that had long since died. Now it had been given a voice. It had been acknowledged. And it had disappeared. Like an empty chair in a church after a funeral, everything seemed to have been done correctly, but no one knew why it felt so empty inside. He ate little. He spoke even less. Once a day, he would go out into the backyard, just to walk around. Briefly. In his bathrobe. On concrete slabs that had become overgrown with moss over the years. Sometimes he nodded to the janitor. The janitor didn't ask any questions. He looked at Harold as if he were a monument that couldn't be interviewed. One day, Amy came to see him again. This time without the box. Just herself. In jeans and an old sweater, as if she didn't want to seem important. "I want to know," she said. "How he died. Not from the report. Not from the recording. From you." He looked away. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. There, that night, there was nothing beautiful. It was dirty. Wet. And scary. But he sat down. And told her. How Lance jumped out of cover because he thought he had time. How the radio crackled. How the first shot missed. And the second hit him in the chest. And how he, Harold, ran toward him, crawled, screamed, but the air was thick as water and his legs were stuck in the mud. "Did he say anything?" Amy asked. Harold nodded. "Not right away. He said, 'Don't tell her I was angry.' I wasn't angry. I just wanted everything to end normally." She covered her face with her hands. She didn't cry. She just curled up. And sat down next to him. "You know, I hated the army for many years. The system. Then I hated myself. For being born into it. And then I saw the photo. All of you. And I realized it wasn't the system that killed me. It was the silence." "Yes," he nodded. "That's what kills you." They sat in silence. For a long time. And somewhere in that silence between them, it became a little easier. Not better. Not brighter. Just not so lonely. A week later, Harold decided to visit the cemetery. For the first time in many years. Not because he had to. But because now he knew he wasn't alone. He went there in his old coat. No insignia. No flags. He bought flowers, plain white ones. And stood by the headstone. On the plaque was a name. No rank. No regalia. Just, Lance Hawkins. Son. Brother. Man. Harold crouched down. He touched the ground with his hands. Wet. Rough. Stones dug into his knees, but he didn't notice. "I'm here," he said quietly. "It's late. But I'm here." He didn't wait for an answer. But at that moment, it seemed to him that the wind had become a little warmer. And the sound of the branches wasn't as empty. The next day, Harold stood at the gate again. Not out of habit. Not out of a vow. He just stood there. Like a man who had stopped asking questions but hadn't yet learned to live any other way. The gate was new. An automatic system had been installed, and now everything was scanned by passes. The soldiers were young, like models. They looked over people's heads, not noticing their faces. Only one of them slowed down as he passed by. "Are you the one with the tape?" he asked quietly. Harold nodded. The young man nodded back. Without a word. And he walked on. Sometimes that's enough. Amy arrived in the evening. She was carrying a bundle. She smiled differently, tired, but without tension. She sat down next to him on the bench. Silently, she opened the package. Inside was a uniform. A veteran's uniform. Without epaulets. With initials embroidered by hand. "This is for you," she said. Not as a symbol. Just as clothing. Comfortable. With a warm collar. Harold took it. He ran his fingers along the seam. He could feel that the fabric was not new. That someone had already breathed, lived, and moved in it. And that was important. "Thank you," he said. But I'm probably not in the military anymore. It's not a military uniform. It's just yours. He smiled. Genuinely. Without bitterness. For the first time in a long time. A few days later, he left the shelter. Quietly. Without speeches. He just packed his bag and left a note on the nightstand. I'm not leaving because I'm tired, but because I can't hold on anymore. He moved in with Amy, not as a burden, but as a guest. In a small room in the attic. There was a table, an old radio, a couple of books, and a window overlooking the park. He would sit there in the mornings, drinking tea and watching the children run around below. One day, a boy looked up and waved at him. Harold was surprised at first. Then he waved back. And that was enough for that day. Veterans who knew him from before started calling. They asked if he was alive, if he was holding on, if he needed anything. Some asked him to tell his story. He didn't refuse. But he didn't talk about the war. He talked about what comes after, when everything goes quiet and you're left behind. He talked about the silence. About photographs that never fade. About how important it is not to burn the tape. Not to forget the voice. Sometimes the listeners cried. Sometimes they got angry. Sometimes they just kept quiet. But they didn't argue anymore. And that was enough. A month passed. The weather changed, autumn was in full swing, leaves were falling with the wind, as if someone had shaken an old blanket over the city. In the house where Harold lived, the heating was turned on reluctantly. But he didn't complain. He was used to the cold. He even seemed to trust it more than people. In the morning, he sat down at the window as usual. In his hands was a mug of tea, his fingers trembling slightly, and a photograph on the windowsill. It was the one with Lance, with those eyes that still had a hint of naivety. He didn't put it in a frame. He just leaned it against the glass so he could see it and it wouldn't get lost. Amy called him to the table, brought him oatmeal, sometimes asked him something, but rarely. They both knew that the important things had already been said. Everything else was just days to be lived through. One morning, she brought a letter. It was simple, with no envelope. On yellowish paper was the Academy's coat of arms. Inside was a short text. Sergeant Harold Mason. Your tape will be accepted into the Academy's archives as part of the Right to Voice program. Cadets are required to listen to it as part of their introductory ethics seminar. With gratitude, the Memory Rehabilitation Committee. He read it and put it down. No joy, no pride. Just a warm heaviness inside. As if something remained after all. Not for him, for those who came after. That same day, he returned to the gate. Not because he had to. Just because it was a habit. Or maybe it was a duty. A group of cadets was already standing there. Some were chewing gum, others were twirling their dog tags on their fingers. Young. Noisy. Lacking the necessary seriousness. He approached quietly. Stood a little to the side. Only one cadet, tall with a neat haircut, noticed him. He approached. Are you the one with the film? Harold nodded. The young man stood up straight. It was as if he sensed that this was not just an old man with a backpack. This was the man who had given them not just instructions, but a history. I listened. It was, he hesitated. It was real. Good, said Harold. Then it wasn't for nothing. The young man didn't leave. He stood silently nearby. Then suddenly he held out his hand. Simply, without fanfare. Thank you, he said quietly. Harold shook his hand. It was warm. Real. Without form. Without lies. And at that moment, he understood, he no longer needed to stand at the gate. Harold never returned to the gate. He still got up early, still drank tea by the window, but there was less tension in his eyes. It was as if an internal sight, always set to wait, had finally been lowered. He began to sort through the box of letters. There were summonses, old certificates, and newspaper clippings where familiar names flashed by. He didn't complain. He didn't even remember, he just sorted. Because now these papers were no longer an anchor, but dust. One day he went out to the park. For the first time in many months, just to walk. No address, no destination. A woman was sitting on a bench with a child. The boy was playing with yellow leaves. Harold approached and sat down on the edge. Quietly. The boy suddenly looked up. "Are you a soldier?" Harold smiled. "I was. A long time ago." "Why?" He hadn't expected that. He froze for a second. Then he looked at the boy, a direct gaze, without fear, without rehearsed phrases. "To remember," he replied. "So you don't forget." The boy nodded. And asked no more. Later, Amy found him in the garage. He was rummaging through an old box where he kept his radio, films, and that very uniform. "What are you doing?" "I think it's time." "Where?" "I don't know. Maybe I'll go. Maybe I'll stay. I'm not looking for anything anymore. Just living." She sat down next to him. "I often think," Amy said, "that if my father had lived, he would have been like you." He was silent. Then he put his hand on her shoulder. "He was better. I just stayed." They sat there for a long time in silence. The garage smelled of dust, iron, and old tobacco. It was cool, but not cold. An old melody came from the radio, no words, just chords. And there was no heroism in that melody. Just life. Simple. Residual. Without morals, but with heart. The next morning, he left a note on the table: "I'm not leaving. I'm just giving up waiting. Everything that needed to be said has been said. Thank you for letting me speak." And he left. In a jacket without insignia. With a thermos in his hands. Around his neck, Lance's dog tag. Not as a burden. As a memory. Spring came quietly. No fanfare, no warmth. It just got lighter one day. People on the street started taking off their scarves, the windows in the shelter were opened, and even the city seemed less angry. No one knew anything more about Harold. He didn't leave an address. He didn't show up on any lists. He didn't call. And no one was surprised. Those who knew him understood, he hadn't disappeared. He just left when he felt he could. Amy came to the gate every month. She brought small paper badges cut out by her daughter, with Lance's name and the words, "I was not alone." The corporal, now a sergeant, allowed her to hang them on the inside wall. One by one. Where there used to be empty reports. One day, a new cadet arrived. He was too young, his voice not yet roughened by experience. He stopped at the wall, looked at the pieces of paper, and asked, "Who did this?" "The man who stood at the gate," replied the sergeant. "And he stayed with us." Somewhere far from the academy, in a small town, in a church with peeling columns, a service was held. No posters, no invitations. Just a memorial service. The sign at the entrance read, "To those who did not live to see recognition. To those who remained silent. To those who returned, even when it was too late." A dozen people sat in the hall. Elderly. Silent. Some came with canes. Some brought boxes of tokens. They did not cry. They did not stand up. They just stared ahead. And in the front row lay that very cassette tape. Alone. Dusty. But turned on. And when the voice rang out, hoarse, tired, but real, no one looked away. Because they knew, this was not the voice of a veteran. This was the voice of someone who had stayed behind. He never became a hero. He was never awarded a medal. His name was never added to the list of heroes. No article was written about him. But sometimes, at the gates of the academy, one of the young people looks toward the road. For a second. 2 seconds. And it's as if he's waiting. Because if he ever reappears, no one will dare say that he's just an old man. This story is not about victory. It's about memory. If you know someone who has been forgotten but deserves to be heard, write the word "stood" in the comments. Let no one else be left alone at the gate.